everyone, and welcome to our YA discussion in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And we have two very lovely guests with us joining us today. I'm the teen librarian and volunteer coordinator here at South Orange Public Library, and what a gorgeous day it is. So thanks to everybody joining us online, and we may get a few kids coming to join us outside, but without further ado, we have middle grade author Sayantani DasGupta, who is the author of The Serpent Secret. Probably can't see that, but she's showing it as well. And she has a forthcoming title for middle grade readers as well. And I'm going to do a slight drum roll. Sayantani, what is the title of that book?
Force of Fire.
Yes. So Sayantani is so lovely to join us today. Thank you so much. And we have also Marina Budhos, whose recent title is The Long Ride. And she is joining us. And both of these ladies are local to New Jersey. Of course, with COVID, we are trying something a little bit different. Some of us are outside, some of us are joining online. But Marina, thank you also for joining us today. So I'm gonna move on over here. And I think I want to make this as natural as possible. So I'm out of view. You guys don't need to see me. The important people are on screen. So I just want to start off. I do have a couple of questions, but I just want to start off by asking you to kind of elaborate a little bit on yourself as writers. And first question being, what made you decide to write? What's your, I'm not a teenager, but I'm gonna perhaps try to think like one and just ask, oh my gosh, what made you decide to write?
Sayantani, do you want to start or?
No, go for it. Go ahead.
Well, I actually like to tell the story of I am one of those people who did want to write from a really early age. Doesn't mean that I knew I was going to be a writer or that it was so easy a path, but I will tell the story that when I was young and growing up and I was about 3 years old, my brother was older than me, and he would trot off to school every day and come back with stacks of books. I'm not sure he was as into the books as I was, but I felt extremely envious that he was going off every day and not getting bored, and also that he had all these books. And so I begged my mother to teach me how to read at home, which she did. What she wound up doing is my father was a teacher, and she brought a Dick and Jane reader home. And from that, she taught me how to read. But right before she was teaching me, I remember staring at these images of little Sally staring at a puddle. She was in her little rainboats and it was rainy. And so she's staring and staring at this puddle, and I know there's a word underneath. And when I finally learned how to read the word, and I made up a whole story. I was like, she's staring at the puddle because her older brother and sister didn't want to play with her and she had a fight. And, I made up this entire elaborate brother and sister story. And then I learned what was underneath the picture, and all it said was "see." And I was incredibly disappointed. It was just these one word pages. But, first of all, that was my, window into reading. But what I said to myself is, well, I kind of can do a better job than that. I can come up with a better story than what I'm reading. So I think for me, from a really early age, there was this relationship between enjoying reading, taking it in, but kind of wanting to make up my own. So that early scribbling and journals and making stories and illustrating stories started early for me. It, cohering into a profession or a path as an author is a whole other story. But I really do trace it back to that moment when the Dick and Jane book didn't measure up for me. And I felt like, well, I can do this better in some way.
We're going to talk about that. I like that you mentioned, Dick and Jane book didn't really do it for you. And I feel like a lot of kids read things because they have to, because they're told that you should really read this book because it's on your age level, or it's appropriate for you, or whatever the reason is. And then they read it and they really don't develop an appreciation for literacy because they've been told to read certain things,
Right.
not necessarily because they have an interest. So we'll touch on that.
Okay.
But Sayantani, please, if you could elaborate a little bit, what inspired you, or why did you become an author?
Sure. Will you let me know if you can hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. So similarly, I was pretty encouraged by my parents at a fairly young age. My father gave me this multicolor ringed notebook, maybe around age 5, to start writing little stories and poems in. And I remember the most important thing he said to me was to always keep all of my writing. And I cataloged it, and it felt serious, like he took me seriously. And that was an incredible gift, to be taken seriously and to be told that all of your writing counts. So in a sense, that's the message I like to give kids, that if you like stories, if you write, you're a writer, right? You don't have to be published. But Marina, I'm glad you brought up Dick and Jane, because I wouldn't have remembered Dick and Jane. But the stories I was exposed to, I was a big reader, I was a big movie watcher, a big story consumer. None of the stories I was exposed to, though, had anyone who looked like me in them, right? We had Dick and Jane who looked nothing like me, or, any of the actually books that I loved, from Madeleine L'Engle to Little Women, there's a treasure trove of stories that I still love from my childhood, but there were no representations of, forget South Asian kids, any kids of color really in any of these stories. And I think at some point you stop seeing any representations of yourself in stories, and you start believing, well, if kids like me aren't in stories, aren't the heroes of stories, then maybe someone like me can't be, right? Maybe someone like me isn't deserving of being a hero. And that honestly became kind of ingrained in me. And I don't want other kids to feel like that, but that is how I felt growing up, not seeing myself. Fast forward 30 plus years, and my own kids are becoming big readers. And I have had other careers. I'm a pediatrician. I, have started teaching. And suddenly my 8-year-old son is saying, oh, I love fantasy. I'm reading Harry Potter and Artemis Fowl and Percy Jackson. But, and this is maybe, he's 18, so this is maybe 10 years ago, none of the kids look like me. I wish there was a kid who looked like me in these stories that I love. And I thought to myself, it's been so many years and things haven't gotten better. He's still having this same experience. And I was like, not 1 second more. I don't want my own kids to feel the way I did. And so I started writing The Serpent Secret. I reached back to the stories, the Bengali folk tales that my own grandmother had told me on long summer vacations to India. And I started adapting them. I took Kiran Mala, who's a real character from a folk tale, and I put her in kurta and combat boots, and I put her in New Jersey. And I, had her parents tell her these fantastical stories about how she's really a princess from another dimension. And it turns out her parents' stories are true. And so she has to travel the dimensions and basically live through these folk tales that I myself had heard as a young person. And so a big part of my, journey into being a children's writer was writing for the 12-year-old me who hadn't seen myself, And then also writing very specifically for my own kids. I started writing The Serpent Secret not realizing it was going to get published, not realizing it was going to be a trilogy that I was going to be, traveling around the country speaking to other kids about. And I think the most interesting thing that I've found is when you write that specifically, I wrote, it's very Bengali. There's Bengali words in it and inside jokes and food and family. When you write that specifically in a funny sense, you can actually become really universal in that. It's in the specificity that your story kind of gains muscle. And that's been my experience, that even though I wrote it for a very specific reason, Toni Morrison says, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, you must write it, right? That was the reason. And the joy of it has been that now I get to share it with so many kids, and I had never imagined to be able to do such a thing.
Wow. I can say that I am not a writer. I am certainly an appreciator, one who appreciates the time and skill and inspiration and creativity and behind the craft that it takes to develop these stories. So
you're a librarian. You're even more important. You're somebody who's sharing these stories with everyone.
Yeah, so I'm a part-time bookseller, if you may. When I do readers advisory, just what I like to do, especially with teens or even rising middle school students, as a middle grade author and somebody who appreciates middle grade titles, I will say to the kids, not, okay, what was the last book that you read, or what's a book that you read before, but really I want to get to know them. So Marina, your stories are more realistic fiction. They're drawing from real experiences, and that's a large part of your inspiration. Whereas Sayantani, there's more of an imaginative approach, fantasy, dystopian that comes into play. And when I'm talking to kids, I'm like, okay, what are you in the mood for? Of course, kids they love food. So if you talk about food with them all the time, it's like, do you like French fries, or you like pizza? What are you in the mood for? They might like both, but they may appreciate more realistic fiction or dystopian sci-fi fantasy. So what's your literary appetite is what I would ask them in terms of what they enjoy reading. Because for me, I'm right now I'm in a phase of listening to audiobooks. Not that I don't want to pick up a physical book, but there's something about just doing something simultaneously and hearing a story and perhaps putting myself in that story. I don't necessarily feel right now at this point today that I can pick up a book and feel like I can dive into it that way. And it's realistic fiction, it's romance, it's all the things that I can just kind of walk and do my own thing type of thing. That aside, I feel like kids approach literacy the same way. Can you let them in, please? I feel like they approach literacy the same way in that they have to be in the mood for something particular. So that brings me to asking you, Marina, to maybe read a little bit from Watched. If you can kind of just give us a little bit of a backstory for Watched, and then do a little bit of reading, that would be great.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you said this, it is true. There's a part of me, I'm really like a fusion of I'm both a nonfiction writer and a fiction author. I publish both nonfiction and fiction. And there's a part of me where I'm always in some way, looking there are nonfiction or perhaps kind of urgent contemporary issues that are out there that I'm aware of and paying attention to, and they often are the inspiration for what will ultimately become fiction. Although there's always a moment where I'm trying to decide if this is going to be fiction or if this is going to be nonfiction. And I think in a certain way, this was seeded back to when I was a teenager, which I was really, really into gritty, realistic fiction when you talk about appetites. That's who I was as a teenager. I was just leaving my office, my little study office, and I realized that's literally sitting in my bookshelf, still there. It was the novel Black Boy, which just completely blew me out of the water. And it wasn't that it was my experience, but I think I wanted to be taken into that experience. And I was really drawn to, I guess I did want to read about tough topics. You know, it was kind of who I was. So all of this by introduction is what Watched is about. So I'm going to read a tiny bit of it because this is fairly early on in the novel. But Watched is a YA novel that is set in Queens, which is where I grew up. And in fact, I like to think of this novel a little bit as my love song to Queens. I got to pour a lot of neighborhood detail into it. It was as if I was taking the Queens of now and the Queens I grew up in, and I merged them together. And my main character, again, thinking about even just a novel like Black Boy and thinking about writing about boys, this character, Naeem, is an immigrant boy growing up. His parents have a kind of shaky existence as shopkeepers. He's originally from Bangladesh. And it's a novel that's about surveillance. I was really, really interested in what it was like to be a Muslim teenager at that moment and sort of almost over visible in a post 9/11 world. I had previously published a novel, Ask Me No Questions, which was about an undocumented family, and that was very much about being invisible. And this is about sort of being hyper visible. And interestingly enough, the setting of this novel is when there was stop and frisk going on in New York City, and the particular neighborhood, Jackson Heights, where his parents have a shop and where he lives, was actually the subway stop there was the second most stops for stop and frisk. And so I felt I'm always looking for kind of the untold stories of the kinds of teenagers they're invisible from, similar to Sayantani, like that are invisible from mainstream narratives in a way. So this is just a little snippet of that. The watching, it seeps into everything in our neighborhood. It's like weather, the barometric pressure lowering. Before the monsoons came in Bangladesh, you could hear the air thicken and squat on your head, a constant ache behind your eyeballs. For the past few years, there's been another kind of pressure, a vibration around us, the air pressing down, muffling our mouths. We see the men coming down the metal stairs from the elevated subway or parked in cars for hours on end. Clean-cut guys, creased khakis, rolled up sleeves, the breath of Manhattan steaming off their clothes. They aren't from around here, that we can tell. Not like the young couples with their big padded strollers or the girls with pea coats and holes in their black tights who move to the nice part of Jackson Heights, carry yoga mats and cloth bags from stores I've never heard of. No, these people are different. They stroll into stores, finger the edges of the newspapers in their racks, check out flyers taped to the side of the fridge. One day, two of them came into my parents' store, pretended to buy some gum, and then asked a few questions about the travel agency upstairs. Where's the man who runs the place, Mr. Ahmed? How often does he come in? Does he stay after hours? Abba shook his head. I do not watch my neighbors so much. He's from Pakistan. That is all I know. Yet you hold packages for him? Yes, but that is because they're not open all the time. It is favor. The man consulted a tiny notebook. You attend the same mosque, Al-Noor Masjid? At this, Abba froze, fingers resting light on the register, staring at the door. No, we are praying at different place. It hurt my heart hearing this. Abba's English when he spoke to strangers was halting, yet proper. He studied some English in Bangladesh and hated sounding uneducated to Americans. Abba, I whispered, after the detectives left and touched his arm. You okay? He stirred and blinked. I am fine, but his voice was rough at the edges. It's his accepting, his hemmed in air, his giving up that makes me crazy. The way he makes that sad gargling noise at the back of his throat, just stands there rocking on his shoes, or shuffles to the back of the store to pray, lets those men scare him. It's in all his hands, nothing more to do, he says. Fight them, I want to cry. Fight me. But he doesn't. He's too tired of his own years, first doing construction in Dubai, then in Brooklyn, long days up on the scaffolding, scraping cement, a new wife and son, and now the store where every month he and my stepmother lean their heads together, write the rent check. One more month, he sighs, then maybe we close up. I gotta go, I said, standing beside him now. I point to my backpack as if to prove myself. He just turned his face away.
So you mentioned, Marina, being hyper visible, and I'm just thinking about there was a point in time when people didn't pay attention or weren't aware of anybody other than them, and it takes something to it takes an event, sometimes an unfortunate event, to take place where now all of a sudden people are looking at everybody, labeling them or being able to identify them as such. And I guess the question I'm asking, I can't think of it. I can't think of the question. I'll come back to that. But for Naeem, how did you come up with developing Naeem's character? Let's start there. How did you develop him?
Okay. So, as I say, I'm always sort of on the alert for themes or topics that I feel a sense of urgency about, but it has to collide in some way with the imaginary and with something that's character-based. So I knew that I wanted to do something around surveillance. A lot of people had read Ask Me No Questions and asked me to do, they said, oh, why aren't you doing a sequel? Why aren't you doing a sequel? But I don't, I left the novel open-ended, and I did not want, it's not a novel where there's something continuous that should happen. But I did know I wanted to return to the world in some way and the political moment in some way. And so if Ask Me No Questions was a moment right after 9/11, this was a moment sometime afterwards, where fear of terrorism and surveillance was in the air, right? And I was hearing a lot about it. But it wasn't until I was actually out to dinner with a friend, and because that's fine, that's a theme, that could be an article, that is what it is. So I keep poking around, and so at that point I went out to dinner with a friend, and she told me about a young man. She was a lawyer who confided to her that he was an informant, because this is about a young man who's pressured into becoming an informant on his community. And he felt really trapped. And yet at the same time, he also felt as if he was in the places of power, that he was going beyond what his father had achieved as a shopkeeper. And so at that moment I said, okay, now I have conflict. Now I have a young man. And I should say, one of my sons, I believe, is in on the Zoom call. At the time, I was raising my 2 teenage boys. And it really was an opportunity that, even though it was fictional, even though I was pursuing this theme, I could pour a lot of the observations I'd had about teenage boys. Some things that aggravate me.
Boys aggravated? What do you mean?
and thinking about, what's their hero's journey? What do you do? And when you talk about representation, this was another thing that really interested me. I feel as if when it comes to Asian Americans, there's that model minority kind of thing out there. And I was really interested. I knew that not all Asian American boys, especially, are necessarily model minorities. There are kids like Naeem that are out there that are falling through the cracks, that are both invisible and hypervisible in a way. And so I really wanted to push back against that. So that was another thing about a kid who gets in trouble, or, you know, and I talked to a lot of teenagers in the process of writing this book to sort of get the texture and feel of that. So, you know, that was the swirl of developing. It's always a combination of something that's out there that I feel some urgency about, a bit of research, and something from my own life that I'm drawing from. And it kind of, there's a chemistry that happens if it works.
So I have a question for the both of you, Marina and Sayantani. Sayantani, if you wouldn't mind also doing a bit of a reading from yours, but you write middle grade for the middle grade audience, and your books have a continuation in the format of series. Whereas Marina, you left this particular book, Watch, open-ended. Question for you before Sayantani begins. Do you have any thoughts on perhaps translating any of your books, particularly Watch, into, like, you know, the small screen, or what does that look like for you, or, you know, to kind of continue, quote unquote, continue,
or expand in some way,
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, and it's, you know, obviously in the last few years, the whole Netflix streaming TV series, all of that is exploded, and it's a new kind of form. And very often it can be, the nugget can be a self-contained novel, but then that's sort of blown up into something larger. So there is a filmmaker, Afia Nathaniel, who's actually a Maplewood resident, who is trying to, she has developed, you know, she has a pilot in mind, she has a series in mind. So she's working on that. And, you know, it's certainly put the idea in my mind, to think about how you sort of blow these things up into the series form. But she's kind of the one who's taking that step with this particular book. And I don't want to say anyone, but I've been working on a nonfiction book of mine as a television series. That's where I kind of took control of that.
I'm always curious to know about that. I mean, the book is always better than the film or what, you know, the TV adaptation, but I'm always curious to know, like, how much input the author has and how that's adapted. But thank you for sharing that piece. Sayantani, please, if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit of, I don't know what you're going to read from.
Yeah, I'm going to read from Force of Fire, which is not out yet. It's a freestanding novel that's coming out June 1st, but it's set in the Kiranmala multiverse, but it's slightly different, and it has a different protagonist, and it's a different entry point into the world. So you can read Force of Fire not having read any of the other novels, and I'm going to read from this. But really briefly, I'll say, in answer to your question, Keisha, you have input as an author into screen adaptations if you're lucky. Because we've been in the process of having a producer go around with the Kiranmala series, and I've had minimal input at this point, but we'll see what happens. So the Kiranmala series, real quick, is again based on Bengali folktales and string theory. Why? Because when I was growing up, I was a big science fiction nut. I love space stories, but I also liked the idea of string theory, this idea that there are parallel universes that exist up right next to each other and may or may not know about each other's existence. I love that as a metaphor for immigrant families, right? That we are galaxy hoppers. We may exist in 2 different multiverses or 3 different multiverses, but the others in those spaces don't know about each other. Only we do. Like, we're the space explorers. So the Kiranmala books are Bengali folktale and string theory based. Force of Fire and its sequel, which is coming out next year, are yes, based on Bengali folktales, but also really inspired by anti-colonial struggles. So my own grandfather was 15 when he went to jail for his role in the Indian Revolution against the British. There were many other family members involved in the freedom struggle. So in Force of Fire, we see Pinky, who is a fire Rakushi. She's a Rakush is a kind of Bengali folktale monster. You say Rakshas in other linguistic traditions, but I use the word Rakush like we do in Bengali. So she's a fire Rakushi. She's not really interested in revolutions or freedom or do-goodery. All she wants to do is learn how to control her fire. But when she makes a deal with the son of the Serpentine Governor General, who's the governing body that rules, the land where she lives, when she makes a deal with this snake prince, she actually becomes a reluctant leader of her country's battle for freedom. So she becomes a reluctant revolutionary leader. And because she's a bit of an anti-hero to start with, I just want to read the first paragraph and then I'll read a bit from a third chapter. So chapter 1 is entitled, "Why None of What Happened is My Fault at All." The day I lost control of my Rakush power, fire vomited in front of half the school, and then basically started a kingdom-wide revolution was absolutely not my fault. All right, whatever. Maybe it was a wee bit my fault, but there were reasons, good reasons, serious, extenuating circumstances. And so she goes on and has a little fire accident. She almost blows up the classroom, the Banyan Grove classroom in which she is studying, and in embarrassment runs off with her 3 young cousins, intriguing human teacher. Can you all still hear me? Something just happened with the screen. You're good? You can still hear me, yes, Marina?
Now we can hear you. You may want to rewind a tiny bit just because we lost you for a moment.
Okay, so I'm going to read Pinky the Fire Rakushi blows up her classroom by mistake and then heads off into the woods in humiliation with her 3 young cousins. And while she's in the woods, she comes across this kind of intriguing human who is a teacher. He's in the woods teaching these young human kids. So this is her in the woods with her 3 young cousins. The ground was dry and dusty under our hands. The rains hadn't come yet, and the long days and short nights caused by the weakening moon were cracking the very land beneath our feet. I saw Dimbo, one of her cousins. I saw Dimbo about to sneeze from some of the dust, but quickly squeezed her nose shut with my fingers. I'm not sure if it was the nose squeeze or the fierce look on my face, but she swallowed her sneeze with a gulp. That's when I heard the sound again. Someone was singing. Not just someone, but a group of high-pitched someones. And what they were singing was the Bengali alphabet song. Hashi didkui, hashi didkui, shouted the childish voices. What in the demon snot? With another warning look to my ridiculous relatives, I peeked up from our hiding place. What I saw almost made me laugh. I was clearly a little too on edge. It was just a small pathshala, an informal school set up by people from a nearby human village. I'd heard there were a lot of them these days, now that Serpent budget cuts had made it almost impossible for regular human schools to keep open. The teacher, though, didn't look like an ordinary village schoolmaster. He was pretty young, not much older than me. Even though he was wearing a patched kurta and dhuti, there was something about the way he held himself that made him seem almost royal. Yet he had no books and no classroom but the open forest. I saw that he had drawn the sharuborno in the dirt with a stick and was pointing to the 12 vowels of the Bangla alphabet as the village children sang. Bah, Darun, that was wonderful, the teacher said in a pained, unconvincing voice. I had to stifle a laugh. It was true, those kids had been way off tune. It's very important you learn these letters and how to put them together. You see, students, our mother language is the source of our strength. The young teacher reached down and gathered a fistful of dry red soil in his brown hand. Our language runs in the veins of this land. Next to me, Dimbo gurgled, letting some dirt run through her fingers just as the teacher had. As I pushed Dimbo back into the foliage, I studied the boy. I'd never had dealings with humans, certainly not humans my age. I'd been sure they were all weak-limbed and pathetic, but this teacher didn't seem like that at all. And then here, I'll just skip forward to some of the students asking this boy what's going on with language. Why don't the snakes want us to speak Bangla, Shurjuda? One of the human school children was asking. The teacher they called Brother Shurjo smiled, poured some soil into the boy's hand, and then closed the child's small fist with his own. I know this might be hard to understand, but the thing is, destroying a people's language, not letting children learn the ways of those who came before them, it's a sure way to kill a culture. So we could get in trouble for speaking our language, even with our families? A worried-looking boy with cracked eyeglasses asked the teacher. Should we stop? Speak more like them? Asked a dirty-faced little one, drawing out her S's like the snakes did. You can adapt. You can learn new things. The teacher was talking to the little girl who had been speaking like the snakes. A beam of sunlight shooting through the leafy canopy illuminated his features as he spoke. You can even leave behind some beliefs of your parents that don't serve you well, but you can never forget who you are or where you come from. That is your strength. That is the source of your real power. So I'll just leave it there.
Wow. I mean, I think there's something inspirational about that, something, to motivate kids to be better, to get courage. I mean, there's underlining messages, I think, in that. So that's exciting. It's coming out in June.
Yeah, it's coming out in June. Lots of bravery and hijinks and, sorry about my phone. And, it's about revolution. It's about friendship. It's also about finding your voice and finding your courage. In the book, the snakes actually end up taking away children and magically removing their voice, their ability to speak. And Pinky and her friends have to figure out how to not just rescue these children, but encourage them, figure out a way to give them back their voice, figure out a way to amplify their voices and hear them. So that's kind of the broader themes of the book. But it's, it's funny and fast-paced and adventurous and fantasy. So if you like those kinds of books, it'll be your cup of tea as well.
I have a question for Sayantani. Can I ask? Yes. When I wanted to mention that your Bengali folktale book, I guess that you did with your mom, is that right?
Yeah.
Many, many years ago, when I went on my Fulbright to Kolkata, I used that book. I loved that book. So I just wanted to do a shout out for that. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, how lovely. I have it here on my shelf. Let's see if it's an arm.
This is before Sayantani. I never met her before, but I came upon this book and we were doing workshops actually, which is where I wanted to encourage students to do retelling of folktales. So it's very similar to what, obviously you're working through in your books, but it was great fun, but it was very interesting in that context because people were sort of like, I can rework them. That, there was a bit of nervousness around these very beloved folktales and changing them up in any modern way. So, which brings me to my question, which is how much of it do you plan out in your novels? It's the writer's question. I'm sort of curious about your process, and how much are you aware or consciously using the folk tales in your planning process or your sketching out process?
I mean, I want to answer the earlier thing you said, which is how I was just talking to a Anishinaabe writer, a Native Canadian writer the other day about this. How do we write community stories, and who has permission to use community stories, that sort of a thing? And I was scared at first, right? These were beloved folk tales that my grandmother had told me again and again. But the thing that gave me courage is, these aren't spiritual or religious stories per se. These are stories that are shared actually by people of multiple religious traditions, right? Bengalis who are Hindu, Bengalis who are Muslim, Bengalis who are atheists, Bengalis who are Buddhist, what have you. And also people from multiple nations, West Bengal, India, Bangladesh, the diaspora. And what gave me courage was the idea that oral stories that are told orally, change over time anyway, right? They change teller to teller. They aren't fixed. There's one translation, Takumar Jhuli by Dokinaranjan Mitra Mujumdar, that a lot of us go to. But there are other ones too. And also any individual grandmother or grandfather or auntie or uncle might adapt an oral story. Let's say some grandkid was being naughty that day, so the theme of the folktale becomes about not lying or what have you. So I gave myself permission in that way to think through the fact that oral stories are dynamic. They're a living, breathing thing that changes over time and space. And so that's what I felt like I was doing. I was just adapting them to new audiences. And I was very conscious about using them and using them as a map. So when I would go to India and hear my grandmother tell these stories, they were my map home. They were my map back to myself. Having not seen myself represented in stories and then only seeing myself in these stories, they helped me plot out a way to figure out who I was, right? And so in the Kiranmala stories, these stories her parents tell her are almost an actual map to her adventure. And when I write my stories, these, the folk tales are also a map. They're a guide to help me figure out how to write the stories. That said, do I plot out everything? Do I outline everything? I should, but I don't. I should be a better plotter, but I don't. I plot out a broad, I have a sense of where we're going and I have a sense of what's happening where. But I do figure out a lot in the editing process and revise a lot in the editing process. First time you write a story, you're telling it to figure it out, and then when you edit it, you're actually refining it. So that's a bit of my process. How about you? Are you a plotter?
No. I'm a we have a train passing, so one moment. See, you can't plan for everything. No, I'm not. I'm a once I've built up a certain head of steam in my mind and I'm starting to see scenes, I write imagistically, I write almost filmically. So I almost see it like a film. Mm-hmm. And so I'm writing dialogue and images, and I have a sense of where it's going. I don't know exactly, but I have a sense. That's when I know I'm on, I've got the velocity to go forward. So I'll have little, I'll write very quickly sort of snatches of scenes that I think are ahead of me. They're almost notes. And then I start digging in and writing. But I really almost, there is a kind of filmic sense for me when I'm writing.
Interesting. Do either of you, with that in mind, have any plans to write graphic novels?
Oh, that's really, so I have one idea that I also co-write with my husband, Mark Aronson, who's a YA nonfiction author. In fact, Sayantani's son helped us with a translation, I think it was, right? For one of our works. So but so we have this idea of doing a graphic novel, which is based on the story of his aunt, who was in open hiding during World War II. And the strange thing was that part of her capacity to be in open hiding was that she had a false identity as somebody who was born in Indonesia, because she was olive skinned. And so strangely enough, right, that identity concealed her as a Jew. And her husband was in the resistance and was a hero in the resistance. And sadly was caught and killed, and she was involved with it. So there's a part of us that think they were both artists. We both think it might make a visual graphic novel of these two people in love, and these, you know, it's a pretty incredible story. And so we've been batting around the idea of maybe that would make a great graphic novel, and I was inspired by the graphic novel White Bird, which I think is terrific. And so that was when it popped into my mind that maybe that's the way to tell that story. But I shouldn't say anything because it may never happen. I hate to throw those things out there. I feel it's like a superstitious thing to talk about something that isn't to be.
Well, I think it's interesting because a lot of teens, for me, or again, even rising middle school students, they might be voracious readers, you know, early on, and then it hits a point where there's a lull. And so graphic novels really come into play to kind of reintroduce the idea of literacy to them, or introduce a topic to them that they may not pick up as a nonfiction book, or they may not pick up as, you know, a fiction book, but a graphic novel gives them that, provides that imagery to tell the story, and they become more interested.
And sometimes very complex. I mean, my kids have read a lot of graphic novels, and like really, you know, Shakespeare and Machiavelli and all these kind of like, you know, way out there topics, and yet they're done in this graphic novel format, and they're amazing.
Even some of the classics, you know, what is it, the To Kill a Mockingbird, or some other stories that come to mind.
I just got a couple of Octavia Butler stories in graphic novel form.
You just got what? I'm sorry.
A couple of Octavia Butler stories.
Oh, really?
So Kindred has a beautiful graphic novel, and I just got Parable of the Sower. But I teach with a lot of graphics, and I happen to teach a lot of Octavia Butler, and I was thinking about teaching, you know, one of these graphics. Although I have 7 books on contract right now. None of them are graphic, but so I have a lot of like other writing to do. So no graphics yet, but I do love graphics. I love teaching with them.
So as we wrap up, I do have one last question for both of you. In terms of, I forget who it was, in talking about amplifying voices. When we think about our auditory learners, those kids who might be more gravitated towards audiobooks, do you have a say in who does the reading of your audiobooks, or do you are you the narrator behind the audiobook?
I was the narrator for the Kieran Mala series. And that was a huge amount of fun. And, you know, because they're fun and they're funny and they're fast, and it was great to figure out how to do all the voices. For this one, Force of Fire, we actually have a new, you know, vocal artist, somebody who's doing the audiobooks, Ulka Simone Mohanty. And she's, having just listened to it to make sure like all the Bengali pronunciations were right. She is hilarious. And I wrote the book and I was laughing on my second listen through. So I hope that people really enjoy the audiobook of this.
Wow. Okay.
I don't want to, and I actually have trouble listening to my own books. I start editing them.
Okay.
You know, I do listen to them, but the say that I have is usually they present to me three potential actors.
Okay.
and I listen to clips of those actors and make a choice,
Okay.
right?
All right.
And so that's the say I'll have, and usually I dig a little deeper to sort of figure out which one makes the most sense.
And then,
But yeah, I actually I have this sort of cringe factor on list. I don't know, somehow having to take in my own books via audio is very hard.
that's fine. It's for me, it's a lot like when I see myself on camera. I'm like, oh, I'll ask the questions, I'll do the interview, but I don't need to watch the clips of it. But yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end. I'm so excited and grateful that you both were able to join us today. I'm sure the kids who will find this on our YouTube page, once it's all ready to go up on the library's YouTube page, it'll be available. They'll take great joy in watching it and hearing from the both of you. And certainly you are welcome to come back to SOPL and just, thank you. And yes, Jenny says thank you so much for doing this. And yes,
Thank
we
you.
thank you as well. We hope everyone is staying safe and, taking all of the precautions necessary. And the library is open. We are doing outdoor programs, and we invite you to come to SOPL. We're here. We're open. And thank you so much, Marina. Thank you so much, Sayantani.
Thank you so much for having us.
And thank
Happy
you,
reading.
Deviani, who's on the call, for organizing everything
Yes.
and all the events that are going on this month. Thank you for that.
Yes, as we honor Asian American Pacific Islander Month, this is really important that we do this. So thank you, Devyani, for suggesting this and coordinating everything. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.